So I do in-home euthanasia, and so it's not like that anymore. Like every day is a little different. Like I'm able to kind of like hyper focus in my appointment, and like the rest of the world goes away when I'm doing that. And then the challenge has been kind of like, how do I structure the rest of my day so that I'm not having this little like bumblebee kind of way of doing it, so that I can be a functioning human in a left brain world with my right brain leading tendencies. So.
Hi, guys, and welcome to the House Call Vet Cafe podcast. I'm Dr. Eve Harrison. I'm a full-time integrative concierge house call veterinarian in Los Angeles, and I help other vets to build their unique mobile practices on their terms. This podcast is for and by house call and mobile veterinarians, so it is meant to give our community a platform to connect, to share our stories, to lift each other up, and to support each other. Most of us work solo as lone wolves, right? So for me, it's been really powerful to be able to physically hear the voices of my colleagues from all over the world and to get a chance to feel that we truly are part of a community of very real other human beings who get it. While you may be alone in that little bubble of your own vehicle when you're on the road seeing patients, I welcome you to join our community by tuning into our own podcast when you're on your way to your next house call. Whether you're a super experienced house call vet with 30 years of experience, you're a brand new prospective house call vet just looking to get started, or you're house call curious, there will be something for you in this podcast. Each episode, you will hear interviews from other mobile veterinarians just like yourself who are doing unique and innovative things, vets who are sharing their stories, their struggles and challenges, and you can also look forward to hearing valuable information and perspectives from specialists and experts outside of our micro niche. And finally, if becoming a house call veterinarian is something that you've been thinking about exploring, or you're looking for some extra support getting your own mobile practice to feel more profitable and sustainable for you, check out the information in the show notes about my course and our above and beyond supportive private community for members only, plus our monthly group coaching sessions within the House Call Vet Academy. You can also check out my free public Facebook group, which is also called the House Call Vet Cafe, the same name as this podcast, and which is a warm and cozy community for mobile vets to support each other in professional and personal development, in creative entrepreneurship, and in friendship. So thank you guys for spending time with me today. Let's dive into the episode.
If you're looking for help with ultrasound scanning, whether that's choosing a new machine or developing your ultrasound skills, check out the First Opinion Veterinary Ultrasound website at fovu.co.uk for independent machine reviews and online and in-person teaching options. FOVU, simplifying ultrasound.
Okay, good morning, guys. We have back with us a very special guest who is my first repeat guest on the show because there was just so much to say and we just couldn't stop talking and there wasn't enough time to talk about all the things. So here we are again, and we're going to continue where we left off. So if you are not familiar with the marvelous Dr. Amanda Doran, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her again and remind you how cool she is. And also, if you haven't listened to the first episode that we did, I think we called it IHE Wizardry and something or other. I can't remember, but it was a cool episode. So episode number 5. That's right. So if you haven't listened to episode number 5, definitely check that out. You can definitely listen to this episode first and then go back, or, vice versa. Up to you. So Amanda does her work as an artist. She's also an author, a speaker, a gardener, a kitchen magician, and practicing in-home euthanasia veterinarian. Amanda's art, writing, and speaking focus on the ethics and options for end-of-life care for humans and animals, effective intrapersonal and interpersonal communication strategies, and how to find what she refers to as work-life resonance. She also facilitates creative learning groups and workshops. Minnesota is her home, where she lives with her partner, 2 dogs, and many houseplants. She also slings tarot cards for fun and secretly wishes that the neighborhood kids think she's a witch. The good kind, of course. They hope. So welcome back, Amanda. I'm so happy to have you here. How are you doing this morning?
Oh, it's so good. Thank you. It's so nice to be here with you. And I'm so glad you invited me back to talk about this more. I think it's really important.
Yeah, there's some subjects that we're going to get into pretty deep. So just a little heads up for anyone
maybe a little trigger warning. We are going to go into some mental health subjects. We might touch on suicide as well. So just giving everyone a little bit of a heads up about that. If that's a sensitive subject and you don't want to talk about that right now, just letting you know in advance so that we can respect what you need. So, again, this is a continuation of our last discussion where, towards the end of the episode, we got into neurodiversity. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more with you, Amanda, and find out a little bit more about your experience with that as a vet. So, can you tell me a little bit more about? I think we talked a little bit about ADHD before.
Yeah. And so just to kind of remind everybody like what neurodiversity means is that is a term that we use to kind of describe just like normal variation in how our brains work. So just like we all have different eye colors and there's kind of a spectrum of normal, there is also is that within the realm of how our brains work. And I feel like one of the things that has been most helpful to me is kind of realizing my therapist said this to me that our brains are not designed to make us happy. They are meant to help us survive.
Yeah.
And all of our thoughts and our feelings, our behaviors are rooted in there. And from the scientific level, like our brains are made of a complex network of cells and they receive information from not only our external environment, but our internal environment too. And it transforms that information into our experience of ourselves and the world around us and our relationships with ourselves and the people around us and the world around us. And it affects how we think and how we remember and how we learn and yeah, like one of the things that's been really helpful for me in understanding my diagnoses, which we'll touch on the other alphabet soup, is kind of yeah, like figuring out like how do our brains work like beyond that? Because that's great, like that's helpful, but it like I ask why and seek understanding in these things. And kind of remembering that we all have a left and a right side of our brain. And in general, we kind of tend to think of that in terms of logic versus creativity or like intellect versus our intuition or sometimes we refer to it as like the rational or the irrational sides of our brains and like it controls the opposite side of the body so the left side controls right side controls left side right hopefully remember this maybe not and sleep at night without knowing that um, but yeah when we think about the left side of the brain like that's all about like linear thinking and analytical thinking and being detail oriented and sequential and the right side of the brain is more parallel processing and big picture stuff and like random things and like intuition. And in our society, we tend to lean towards like collectively and value more kind of left brain processes and left brain ways of thinking. So even like when we think of like, it wasn't so very long ago that like people who use their left hands to write would get slapped with rulers or
My
like,
grandmother did. My grandmother
yeah,
told me that how that happened to her when she was a child.
yeah, like, I'm left-handed, I remember learning that, I was like, "Oh my gosh, no one's doing that, but okay." And even, like, how like, in Latin, like, we refer to, like, left as, like, sinister, but, like,
Mm.
the original meaning of that word was not that, it was evil. But so kinda realizing, like, okay, this refers to how we process information, how we engage in our projects, how we perceive things, how we work best with workflow and solve problems, and I think as individuals, like we tend to kind of favor one side or the other. And like Myers-Briggs would be an example of this.
Yeah.
Even like with that, all the like left brain things are on the left, all the right brain things are on the right. And I think even like thinking about like some people have a negative idea of like what introversion means, kind of a negative connotation of that. But really, we all have all the things. And if we think about it on like macro level, like we're all kind of just like electrobiochemical soup
We are.
and made of the same parts. And yeah, and depending upon our genetics and our environment that we were raised in, parts of those bits got expressed and some of them got suppressed. And deep down in our heart, we have kind of this true self. And then, like, based on those things, we kind of create our ego or like how we see ourselves. And then kind of based on what other people perceive. Like we have these personas that we project, and like we are all of the things because we can't be all of the things. Like that's nirvana, right?
Right.
But yeah, we live in this left brain world and really are like built on these left brain values. And I think,
Especially in the vet world too.
oh my God, well, and like even beyond the vet world, like it's present in medicine, it's present in politics and law, and
Yeah.
education and
Professional world, yeah, any professional realm.
yeah, and if we even think about it on like a grander scheme, like that's kind of how like civilization has been rolling for about 5,000 years. And so if you are someone who kind of leans more to this right brain thinking, like it can be really hard to cope in the left brain world. And so one of the things that's been really helpful for me is learning language to talk about these parts in myself without pathologizing them.
Mhm.
And when I think about ADHD, like one of the things that I learned about recently, I'm in this ADHD craft group on the Facebook, and there's this
Very
lady who is she's a psychiatric nurse practitioner and has ADHD and was talking about like really kind of this neurotypical versus like neurodivergent kind of idea is a lot in relation to the ways that we process things and people who experience ADHD, as we call it, are parallel processors. And you can't really do like multitask isn't like really a thing, but like my tendency is to do several things at once. Like they still get done, but I'm not always like doing like one thing and then another thing and then another thing. Like that's just not
not
like
linear.
not yeah, I'm not a linear processor. And so
Right.
yeah, when you're perceiving things differently and kind of bringing so much in order to like be successful in kind of these professions in a left brain world, you have to kind of put on masks and develop coping mechanisms.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, because if you don't, like these things come out as what we call neuroses. That can be a problem and it can be very difficult to function in a linear processing world when you are a parallel processor. And the other thing that this lady said that I thought was just so helpful was this idea of like a farmer versus a hunter. If a farmer is working on a project and they need a hammer, they're going to go to their tool shed and grab a hammer and they're going to finish the job. A hunter is wandering around in the forest and they don't really have the means to carry everything with them. So they probably don't have a hammer with them. So they're going to look around the forest and find something that they can use for a hammer and be like, okay, like what can I use for a hammer? And she said in modern day, this kind of translates into like you go into Home Depot and you find a hammer and you're like, what else can I use this hammer for? Like if that resonates with you, you might be a neurodivergent person as well. Oh, like what? Like but yeah, I think our society, we live in a society that was built by farmers, and it can be really, really hard to cope with that if you are a hunter. And so, really kind of thinking about these farmers are kind of that like neurotypical phenotype, and hunters are kind of in this like neurodivergent category. But remembering like we all have all the things, and like hunters have had to adapt and kind of regulate ways to manage things like time and emotions and memory and relationships. And you have to kind of suppress or mask some of these maybe more natural tendencies. And yeah, I think clinical practice was really hard. I had a hard time like going through a day in a linear way. Like I found I was always doing like 10 things. And
Well, see,
like,
that seems to me like what they they require, and I'm like, "That's what I'm not good at."
yeah,
So, for me, it's
um,
I don't know.
but yeah, and it seemed like I always had like so many balls in the air and like was able to
Mhm.
like hyper focus on like one thing at a time. But it was so much input happening all at once. And like usually like my medical records would be the thing that would suffer. And I'd get to them at the end of the day. And I'd have a hard time just like sitting down, doing one and finishing it and then going to the next one. Because everything else was still happening all
Yeah,
around.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, I feel like that's been really helpful to kind of think about, and, like, so I do in-home euthanasia, and so it's not like that anymore, like, every day is a little different, like, I'm able to kinda, like, hyper focus in my appointment, and, like, the rest of the world goes away when I'm doing that, and then the challenge has been kinda like, how do I structure the rest of my day so that I'm not having this little, like, bumblebee kind of way of doing it so that I can be a functioning human in a left brain world with my right brain leading tendencies, so like, that's like gotta, like, bring it back into, like, it's okay that I'm like this.
Yeah, yeah, I love that, and kind of, like, knowing the physiology and the net like, the pathways, basically, that create this experience that you have, I can see how that could then, help guide you to work with what you got and work with what is a superpower, as they sometimes say, or your strength, and what's maybe more challenging, and to know about that, and also to understand the inherent challenge of having a strength in the right brain in a world and especially a profession that wants left brain, left brain, left brain, and
Mhm.
to be aware of that, I think is so important, and I love how you break it down, and I love how you're so dedicated to which I think we all should be, and it's an ongoing path to removing this sort of pathologizing language that we pick up when we talk about these things. So I love that you broke it down in the way that you did. That's really cool.
Thank you. And I feel like this is like what it means, like to end the stigma. So not only educating other people about what this means and how it works, but also like changing those like internalized like negative beliefs that we have. Yeah, I think a lot of times like people who think this way have been seen as not so nice, like not so and not such a bright light.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's hard to do.
I think you're the brightest bulb of them all.
Oh boy.
Sorry, there's my cheesy factor, sappiness. So, you mentioned to me recently, actually, that you also have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder too. If we're okay jumping into that subject, I think it's incredibly brave and beneficial to everyone who is listening and myself and everyone that you're able and willing to talk about this openly and, help remove the stigma there as well. Would you be able to tell me a little bit about what it's like in that world and maybe talking about it a little bit more in recent times, which I think it's been fairly recent that you've been opening up about that. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I found, like, as I started to kinda talk about ADHD, like, I felt like I had this secret, knowing that I also got this diagnosis of bipolar disorder too around the same time, and, like, there are definitely people who have both, and sometimes one can be misdiagnosed as the other in both ways, because there are some things that kinda overlap, just so because it's kind of a confusing thing and they're different types, so people know like another form of neurodivergence is this idea of bipolar disorder. And this is really a mood disorder. So it's very much related to emotions. I've also heard it described as a disorder of circadian rhythm. And like that is something that has been really helpful for me. And I've been learning a lot about astrology and like kind of finding those words to describe how I'm feeling, like in relation to the rest of the world. And there's a lot of different factors that can contribute to it. Like often there's a genetic component and environmental factors. A lot of people have a history of long-term stress or like trauma or abuse as a young person. And it's essentially a disruption of like quote unquote normal mood patterns and often with periods of stability in between. So some people have bipolar disorder too, means that I have had more than one period of severe depression. And then kind of as the pendulum swings on the other end, like a lot of people with bipolar disorder too experience periods of hypomania. And when that happens, tend to be can more impulsive and have more energy and seem like very like outgoing and productive. And some people I think even think like, oh, that sounds great. Like you're productive. It's like, well, it's until it's not, because like that can actually push you to like mania. And bipolar disorder one is when you have had at least an episode of like severe, like a manic state. So they used to call this like manic depression. And in those, like, as it progresses to that, like, you get to the point where you just, like, go and go, and it's like this, like, energy that you just can't, like, let move through you, and, like, don't eat and don't sleep, like, people feel very irritable, you can have delusions of grandeur, like, sometimes people think, like, they're God, or they can fly, or, like, they can do anything, or, like, invincible, and that's, like, pretty scary, and so, like, if you like most people kinda experience, like, a normal range of emotions throughout the day, like, you wake up and like, "Oh, I'm kinda crabby," and then you see a friend and you're like, "Yay," and sometimes you get really sad, like, "Oh, my cat died," or, like, get super happy. It's like, "It's my birthday!" But then the problem becomes, like, in people with a bipolar disorder is you kinda get stuck on one end of the extreme or another, and if you stay there for, like, days, weeks, months, like, it runs the risk of kinda pushing you into these severe extremes, and that can lead to psychosis and psychiatric admission, and in the depression side of things, what becomes really scary is thoughts of, like, suicidal ideation, and, like, when we talk about, like, superpowers, I think sometimes we label these conditions as superpowers, and I think that can be kinda dangerous, and
Yeah.
it might prevent people from seeking treatment because I think it's also kryptonite. Like, a lot of times we don't talk about sometimes, like, I'm on the couch for 3 weeks and, like, I feel like I haven't done anything, and it's like, I don't have the energy to do it. And so I think really, like, my superpower is my brain, and, like, we all have superpower brains, and if we learn kinda how they work, like, we can we can't like make things go away that happened in the past, but we can learn to accept ourselves for who we are and learn to live with them. And so I really kind of feel like my gift is like the way I've been able to like reframe this is like I have this capacity to really like feel those extremes of human emotion. But if I don't have the ability to like communicate these deep feelings that I have and they get trapped inside me, like that can become life threatening and that can become very dangerous. And so it's felt like this deep, dirty secret that I've had for my whole life. And like I was raised in a family where like, my parents are wonderful people, like my siblings are wonderful people, like my ancestors are wonderful people, but they carried a lot of pain. And like there's a lot of like intergenerational trauma and like grew up in a house where we didn't really talk about feelings. Like if I felt lots of like joy, like sometimes I would be told like I was being silly and I needed to calm down and things like sadness and anger, like we're not like none of us knew how to feel those feelings. And we kind of get these scripts that are passed down from our parents and it takes a lot of time and a lot of work to be able to rewrite those stories and like develop our own scripts. And I think that doesn't always happen until later in life. And like my parents were really young, like when they had me, I think they were still working on like rewriting their scripts. And like everybody's doing the best they can from where they're at. And like it's been a long road of learning not to like blame anybody for this, learning to
Mhm.
forgive people and like forgive myself for times I did not act with wise intention. And just really realize like, you know, I'm not perfect, but, like, everything has happened absolutely perfectly. Like, I could not be this wonderful enchantress that I am sitting in my closet with you talking about these things if these things hadn't happened. And, like, we kid ourselves sometimes, like, thinking things could have happened any other way, and I feel like for a really long time, like, it was not safe to talk about these things, and it's taken me, like, years of finding safe spaces where I could talk about it before I have been able to, like, talk about it openly. For the longest time, like, I didn't talk to my parents about it, like, nobody talked about it, and, like, I only recently, like, after being diagnosed, like, a year ago, have been able to, like, share this with my boss, and my husband and I didn't talk about it for a long time, like, it was like my 1 month free trial of Not One More Vet to BetterHelp, where I really started to like unpack some of this stuff that I was carrying around for a long time. And I think being this person who is like very deeply intuitive, but like not having the space to like feel these feelings or not like know how to express them in a way that was healthy, like they kind of just got like trapped inside. And I think it's so hard because like sometimes like we don't know like how bad it is until it gets really bad. And so I feel very grateful for kind of these like, really I had this experience when I was a teenager, like, I think kind of when this all started where, like, I did attempt suicide, and obviously it didn't happen because 'cause I'm still here, but I got
For that.
yes. Thank you, by the grace of God. Yes. So, but then I was admitted for psychiatric care and just buried it, and so, like, spent the first, like, 2 weeks of my freshman year of high school, like, in an outpatient treatment, and then just I was like, "I need to pretend everything's okay or, like, bad things will happen." And I don't know, that was the story I told myself for like 20 years until I got to notice like those feelings of darkness coming back. And I was like, oh, I need to do something about this or like things will get really bad. And I think in some ways, like, it makes me grateful for this like really horrible experience that I had when I was a kid, but it helped me kind of find a little bit of light in that darkness and know like I can't do this by myself. Like if I don't like reach out to somebody, I won't come out of the darkness. And yeah, it's very scary and it's been a long road of healing. Yeah, started to take my mental health very seriously like a year and a half ago and come a long way. And like it's hard because you only see like the things on the outside
Mhm.
and really, this is an inside job, like 100%. And yeah, that's what's been going on.
Wow, thank you for sharing so vulnerably and so openly and just really, really getting to the heart of it. And I appreciate that so much. And I appreciate you so much. And just before we move forward with some of the other subjects that we're going to get into, almost every time I talk to Amanda, I cry because she touches me so deeply. So we'll see if that happens. I'm a little bit more like in go mode when I'm recording a podcast. So maybe it won't. But disclaimer there. That could happen.
Sometimes I've had a
But I just it's just so moving to hear about your story, and I love, as always, how you kind of sprinkle in magic into your experience. You talked a little bit about astrology before when kind of linking things into circadian rhythms and, I think all the tools we can get, magic, and however that works in our brains, like whether it's literal, whether it's metaphorical, whatever it is to us, whether it's just more joyous to think of things that way. I love that. I'm all about it. I love how you kind of bring creativity into your healing process as well. And I love that something in your journey since your attempt to take your life taught you to recognize a moment when that was coming back and how lucky and how grateful I am. I mean, the whole world needs you, obviously, how grateful the whole universe is that you were able to recognize it early and get help and you were strong enough to do that. So awesome. And so a clarifying question. So bipolar 2 is that you've had if it's okay to ask, you've had at least 2 episodes of depressive. Is that right? So this is a second episode and that
Yeah.
defines this as bipolar 2. Did I understand that right?
In general, yeah. So like, still a student of this work, but I believe it is that bipolar 2 is multiple episodes of that severe depression. So like,
Eh,
definitely people can have an episode of severe depression and find themselves like on this road to like deep darkness, and
mhm.
it may never happen again. But I believe one of the criteria for diagnosis is having these multiple episodes. And as I look back on my life, I think there may have even been like at least one other one. So like three kind of major episodes. And that was kind of around the time where we talked a little bit about the jobs I've had, but like in the last episode, but I worked in Canada and things were kind of starting to fall apart. And it was at this time where I was starting to kind of feel like these very intrusive, dark thoughts again. And everything just changed and is almost like I didn't have the ability to kind of focus on those thoughts because the things that were happening right in front of me were like, oh, I can't live in this country anymore and I have to
Oh,
move back and find a new job. And like all these other things were like at the forefront. And sometimes those like major depressive episodes can be triggered by like some kind of trauma. And so like for me, my cat died a year and a half ago. And like in some ways, like I think she had kind of started to like represent almost like an anchor and like all these like memories that like I hadn't processed. And like my dog died in vet school and like never really processed that. And so it was kind of like all this stuff came up and that was in July. And I was just like super depressed for I think it was like October when I reached out for help and just kind of realized like, hey, like really been feeling pretty low for a while. And some of the things that I'm thinking like are probably not very safe. And
yeah.
yeah, I feel very grateful for the resources that are out there and that it is becoming talked about more. And there are like places that say healing happens in safe spaces. And
Yeah.
sometimes they're hard to find and like it doesn't always feel comfortable to talk to people that you're really close to. I think you have to kind of have sometimes like somebody who doesn't know you and isn't biased, like to be able to kind of hold mirrors up and say like, well, maybe these are some of the things that these internalized negative beliefs that you have. Like, let's challenge these stories and maybe start to rewrite them in a way that's more empowering. And
Mhm.
yeah,
Thank you for sharing that. I think intrinsically, this is a very healing conversation for me and for anyone who's listening, just to hear your story raw and honest and open. And with the way that you phrase things and the language you use and your journey, I think it's just really a beautiful one for people to hear about. So, I want to talk in just a moment about an organization that you recently got involved with, and you wrote a really
uh,
cool piece for them. So, maybe in just a moment, we'll touch on that. I want to hear all about that. But backing up a little bit, is it okay if we talk a little bit about suicide on the air right now?
yes. I try to be very mindful of the language that I use because I know it's a very sensitive subject and not everybody is in a place where they can talk about it. But yes, like as I've learned to retell my story, like I have definitely like gotten to a place where I feel like I can talk about it. Like for a long time, like couldn't even bring it up without like bursting into tears because it is really sad. It's really hard. And I think when you're in that state of mind, like you just feel so alone and like so by yourself and like completely disconnected from like yourself and from other people and from the world. And yeah, I think sometimes we can't talk about these things until like we've put them a little bit behind us. And so I know that hearing other people tell their stories is something that helped make me feel brave enough to start to talk about it. And so, yeah, if we can be a light for others who are on the path to follow, like, I would love to do that.
Thank you so much. That
I'm
really,
starting to
really
cry a
like
little bit.
yeah, that's okay. I mean, that's good. Like someone called it like soul pee. Like it's like we have to get some of these things out, and there are times it's like absolutely appropriate to cry. And so like I sort of prime myself too and our audience that there may be some tears. But the thing is it's really serious. It's really it's heavy, and it's also really, really important. And I think given the problem we have in our industry with high rates of suicide, I think it's something that we almost can't responsibly not address. And I've known a number of people who've taken their lives, some with mental disorders, some without, to anyone else's knowledge, some family members. So for some reason, I mean, I think all vets have a little bit more of an immersion in this than your run of the mill person. And you obviously have your own intensely personal experience with it. And so, kind of as a result of this in my life, I actually just got QPR certified in suicide prevention. QPR stands for question, persuade, and refer. It's sort of like CPR for people in your life that might be suicidal. Like what are the first steps just to kind of get them out of immediate harm's way. And so this has been on my mind a lot for my whole life, but since this training, it became even more clear to me that that having this conversation together is highly therapeutic for everyone. You know, just getting things out there and removing the stigma, letting it be talked about, and knowing that, you know, if you yourself are in a state, whoever you are listening, where you're considering suicide, that, you know, we can talk about it and you're not alone and it's possible to come through on the other side. So who better to talk about it than a survivor? So I would love to hear your thoughts, like kind of freestyle, like whatever you want to say about this subject. I'd love to
Ugh,
explore that a little bit if you feel safe to do so.
yeah, it definitely is becoming more like public knowledge that this is an issue in our profession. And like, I think even just like across the board, like, you guys, like, we've been in a pandemic and like the world is changing. Like, the old world is literally dying and a new one is being born. And I feel so grateful that, like, I don't actually personally know anyone in our profession that has taken their own life. I know other people, like, from other walks of life, but there was a really beautiful article that came out in NPR just a couple days ago. I think we're gonna put a link in the show notes, but it said that 1 out of 6 veterinarians have contemplated suicide, and I always find the statistics a little startling to hear that, like, it's 2.4% higher than the rest of the population for females and 1.6% for males. And like one of the things that they really talked about in this article is like burnout and how, it's not just doctors and nurses, but like veterinarians too. And I also kind of think
That
like,
text as well.
yes, yes, absolutely. So like in our profession as opposed to the rest of medical profession, I think part of it is like we're kind of these like frontline healers. And over at least like, 14 years ago or whatever, when I got interviewed for vet school, like they were starting to kind of change the criteria for who they were letting in and like bringing in more empathetic people. And like when you are empathetic, it's because you can like recognize those feelings like in other people. And, I think about like burnout, like literally, we only have like a finite amount of energy that we're allotted like from the universe every day. And like especially if you are somebody with like chronic illness, like this idea of like spoon theory where like you might not have as much energy as a normal quote unquote person. But I think a lot of these things that we're feeling is because as intuitive people in a left brain society, like a lot of times our value comes from the ability to serve others. And with animals, like they start to represent these parts of ourselves that we've had to cut off from the world. And one of the things that they talked about in this article, like the lady said, like, for these people, like for the animals, like especially in the pandemic, they have become such a big part of our lives. And like think about like how much our relationship with animals has changed, like since the time we have all been on this planet. When I was a kid, my grandparents had a German Shepherd that was like their protection dog. And like I think they fed him kibble, like maybe. but he was there to protect the farm, and, like,
Yeah.
when they came off the farm, like, they got a pug, and he slept in their bed, and I was like, "Who are you? Like, what is happening?" But yeah, and, like, they said in the article too, like, they represent, like, a part of our being and, like, these kind of, like, lost parts of ourselves, and, like, for a lot of people, like, their animal is, like, what they live for, and, like, we see this in, like, kind of the rise of emotional support animals, and it's very hard when you're a very empathetic person and you're very connected to animals and wanna help people to draw that line, especially, like, if you're a right brain person in a left brain world and you haven't necessarily like, we talk about boundaries so much, but, like, sometimes you don't know where the line is unless somebody crosses it, and,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
if you don't have the language to say, like, "Here's the line," like, the other kind of thing that's been very helpful with me is kind of visualizing myself as, like, I am a Care Bear in armor. Like, I only have a finite amount that I can't help all the animals, and I think especially when you're a new grad, like, in practice and, like, a pandemic and everybody's short-staffed and, like, not taking new clients. And there's like 10 clinics in my town, and I don't think anybody's taking new clients. And like if you are a client, it's like months before you can get in for wellness stuff. And like sometimes surgeries are booked out like 3 to 4 weeks. Like we don't have capacity within the system to handle everything. And I think some of our systems, like as far as like medicine and politics and education, like they're kind of medieval and we're
Oh,
dealing
yeah.
with like primal emotions. And now we have the technology of gods and like things happen so fast and like it's changed so much. And I think a lot of us like, our parents or maybe our grandparents are kind of the last ones of that generation where one parent, usually the male, like worked outside of the home and was the primary breadwinner, and the other parent, usually the female, stayed at home and did kind of the emotional labor and kind of the home labor things. And it's very, very hard like, we're having this transition, like, over the last, like, 50 years, really, like, it's happening slowly, but I think, like, when I think about, like, ladies having that or people who identify as female, like, having this higher rate, like, I think it's because, like, we've kinda been holding ourselves to these, like, standards of, like, masculine values and, like, kind of this, like, superwoman kind of idea back in, like, the '80s and '90s of you can have it all in a career and a family and a husband and all and it's like we only got so much gas in the tank every day, and, like, I think with burnout is you start kind of borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today, and it makes me think of even, like, we have a wood stove and, like, we put up so much wood, like, for the winter. If we use all the wood by January, thankfully we have a furnace, but, like, if this was the old times, like, we would freeze to death, right? Like, we would run out. So there's only, like, so much you can do, and so I think that's part of that armor, and, like, when we start off, we're like little Care Bears with, like, pots on our heads, and we're holding, like, wooden spoons, and we're, like, in front of our shields. Yeah.
Can I just, like, pause for a minute to
Yeah.
tell you that metaphor that you have, a Care Bear in armor, you mentioned that same thing in your lecture that you gave in the Wool Vet virtual conference, and it spoke to so many of us, like, when you said that, my jaw personally dropped because I was like, "Exactly what I am," and then lo and behold, all the comments followed like, "Oh my god, a Care
Oh,
Bear in armor," and like 800 people were like, "Yes, that's me." So you speak truth for so many of us veterinarians doing what we do.
oh,
So anyway,
yeah.
back to you, just had to interject that.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, yeah, and, like, when you are, like, an empathetic person, like, when you do embody more of those, like, traditionally, like, feminine values, which has nothing to do with, like, gender or genitals. You're living in that right side of your brain, like, you kinda got a soft underbelly and, like, you wanna help and you wanna be of service, and I think we have a society that's been built on a lot of people, like, doing those things for free and, like, having that power kinda taken away and kinda recognizing also, like, there are times when we give that power away.
Yeah.
And if you've been conditioned yeah, it's really hard, and I kind of imagine it as, like, yeah, you're starting off with a pot on your head and a wooden spoon and, like, a cutting board shield, but, like,
Yeah.
also in the Star Wars, like, we have to, like, forge our, like, Mandalorian Beskar armor one
Yes.
piece at a time, and
Yes.
sometimes yeah, like, like, you don't know when the line has been crossed until like, people don't know where the line is, and neither do you, like, until it has been crossed, and I think sometimes we have to get burned in order to know, like, fire is hot.
Uh,
And
yes,
yeah,
Disney Plus references are on point. I'm waiting for your Encanto reference. I know it's
oh,
coming.
oh, yes, we're gonna talk about Bruno. Did you watch it?
I watched 30 minutes of it last night before
Oh my
bedtime. I have to
god.
finish the
Okay.
rest of it today.
You can finish
It's
it. And if
beautiful.
anybody listening has not yet watched it, we're gonna give you a chance to pause right now, go watch it, and then come back and listen to the rest. Yeah, I feel like Disney knows, like, not enough people have been going in therapy, and, like, movies like Soul and, like, Inside Out and, like, ugh, Encanto, like,
Ah,
ugh, there's, Louisa, like, the strong sister, like, there's so many ladies who, after seeing that movie are like, "That's me." Like, that, like,
yeah.
anxiety of, like, just, like, this pressure and feeling like, "Oh my gosh, when does it end?" And, like, you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, and, like, there's another article that we're gonna put in the show notes that talked
That
about kinda some of these different, like, archetypes. Like, Mirabelle, the main character, like, is kind of this, like, healer who feels like she's never enough and like trying to keep her family together and they're not talking about feelings and like it really talks about like intergenerational trauma. I'll try not to give spoilers for Harrison who's not yet watched a movie, but all of you have gone and watched it. And so you have to come back. But like we carry the pain of our ancestors and like if they don't heal it, they literally like pass it down to us in our DNA and like we inherit it in those scripts and the other sister Isabella is like perfectionism is kind of her toxic trait, if we will. Like her gift is like to make all these flowers and we find out as the movie progresses that maybe that's not really what she wants to be doing and like she becomes empowered through being able to express like her anger and her resentment to do something different and like make something that's like more true to her heart and yes, my favorite is Bruno, and there's a song, it's like the most popular one, they're like, "We don't talk about Bruno." And so I try not to spoil her. So Bruno is I feel like he kinda represents, like, neurodiversity, like, he is somebody that has big feelings and thinks very differently, and because of some of the things that he has done, which are true to his nature, like, he becomes shunned from his family and, like, isn't able to express these emotions and is very taboo and, like, redemption comes at the end. But, yeah, like, kind of these, like, really taboo things that are really hard to talk about, and so the article is, like, why therapists wanna talk about Bruno and kinda breaks down, like, these different characters, and, like, it's hard because there's not always, like, Disney endings, like,
right.
to our stories, right? And, like, we don't live in magic houses and have, like, magic candles that, like, hold the light for us, and, like, I really wish I had a magic house, but, kind of
Bring
there's
that magic to all of us, though. Like, you're
I do have a magic
like, if I have anything to say about it, there will be magic. Like,
I do have a magic house, that's right. Those who don't believe in magic will never find it, like, my house is magical,
that's right.
because I make it magical.
But you're
Uh
right. I mean, you're right. Like in the veterinary world, we're living in that place where we don't have that magic, the literal magic to kind of get that redemption necessarily. And so we have to, I think the conversations we're having are so important so that we can have your magic and your experiences and all of that stuff. Like it's tricky. It's tricky.
It's really tricky, and I think intergenerational trauma, like, also exists in our professions, like, not just in our families, like, it's kind of this idea of, like, "Well, I had to go through this, so you do too."
Oh
And, like
God, there's nothing
right?
worse. Nothing worse.
No, and it's so hard, it's like, "No, like, please make it so, like, people who come after you don't have to, like, heal your wounds," and, like,
You
I'm
the
very
story of my entire surgical residency. I have it, so you have to as well. Anyway.
Yeah, and it's so hard to, like like, the grandma, like, in the story, she was trying to be, like, very controlling and, like, protecting, and it's very hard to see those that have hurt us or those who have abused us or have wronged us and to empathize with them and to not blame them. Like, everybody's doing the best they can from where they're at. Sometimes my best has been pretty shitty, and, like, we're all just trying to survive our
Me
path.
too. Me too. Thanks for
Yeah.
creating space for me to say that out loud because
Absolutely, and it's important like, those feelings are valid, like, it's important to say, like, "Hey, this hurts." But I think we get ourselves in trouble when we, like, kind of fall into those, like, cycles of blame, and, like, we could probably do another episode on, like, the drama triangle and victim consciousness.
oh, yeah.
But, like, yeah, to kinda, like, take that step back and be like, "What are the things that I can really control?" But also to not let people, like, get away with things. I think sometimes it's very difficult to kinda deal with the consequences of those behavior, and, like, I think some people do, like, purposely take power from others, and some people
Yeah.
are, like, willfully negligent of the effect that they have on other people, but I think a lot of times, like, people don't know what they do, and it's very
Right.
hard to, like, call people out in a way when we haven't been given places to, like, feel our feelings, to express them in a place that doesn't bring out rage or like
Right.
yeah, like blaming or like persecuting or like trying to control each other and like kind of taking that step back and be like, okay, like what are the things I can control? Like what are the things that I can't? What can I change here? And like really seeing like as they say, like the forest from the trees. Like if you're standing in front of a tree, like sometimes our temptation is to like grab a chainsaw and like cut it down. And we don't realize like if we kind of take a step back and or like an aerial view, we can step aside and take a different path. And that's a really hard thing to do, and I think things are gonna change an awful lot between now and when, like, we retire as far as, like, the infrastructure of medicine, and, like, the pandemic has really brought a lot of these issues that were bubbling under the surface, like, out, and, like, I think it has to come out in order for us to move through it, and
To heal it, to feel it,
yeah.
as they say.
Yeah, but yeah, like intergenerational trauma, like within our professions is also real.
Very.
And I think it's interesting, like, I think we're at a point where like females outnumber males like 2 to 1, but we're still living in this infrastructure where kind of those, I'm going to say patriarchy,
Yep.
but I think we have to be careful not to like demonize like the quote
And
unquote like
right.
old white dudes. Right. Cause it's like there's not a single individual that is responsible. Like
Right.
this is the story that we've been handed down for like 5,000 freaking years. Like,
Yes.
like,
Yes.
yeah. And like, I don't love the like smash the patriarchy phrase because
Right,
I feel like
right.
in some ways like that's like toxic femininity here. Like I
And
think sometimes we try to like flog things that need very gentle coaxing.
yeah.
And yeah, like I'll say it again, like healing happens in safe spaces. And so we have to start by finding those safe spaces, learning to tell our stories. And then once we can tell our stories in ways that are not demonizing or pathologizing, create more safe spaces for healing to happen. And yeah, it's an inside job. I think sometimes like we look for somebody to come and rescue us and somebody come save us and like, oh, it's really hard to like take that journey into the underworld and like really take a good hard look in the mirror at some of these things that like stories that tell ourselves that just aren't true. And like, yeah. So we're talking about Bruno. Yeah, healing those generational wounds.
Yeah.
It's so important. And yeah, like time has changed so much and the ways that things happen. Like even thinking about like a century ago, like what things were like. And even like 20 years ago, like it's like breakneck speed that I think a lot of this is happening. And like there's a new world that's being born. And I think as healers, like we are really like at the forefront of that. And even just beyond like being a veterinarian, like I think kind of that archetype, like that idea of healer has really changed. Thinking about like historically, in recent history, we would practice this very paternal like method of medicine where like we tell people what they need to do. And like there's definitely circumstances like emergency medicine where that's still very necessary.
Yes.
But I think one of the reasons I've been really drawn to like end of life care is kind of more this like partnership model and kind of being like as an intuitive person like well what do you need and there's not time to do that in the clinic and so I think we need to become integrative specialists in a way like kind of find those things like what's the thing that lights you up and like makes you feel like you are being in service to society like without sacrificing yourself and stop doing all the other things and like that does mean like probably some practices will no longer be open. Like we have a lot of bargaining power as associates right now and kind of deciding like where we want to put our energy. And yeah, there's kind of this shift from I think almost kind of back to like ancient times of like where the healer was like someone who like helped the person like heal themselves and like kind of
Right.
about like the shamans and like the medicine men and the medicine women and like the village healers
Right.
and yeah, it's almost like a God complex almost. And I think this still lives in the minds of patients and of clients where like, I bring you this animal, it is a part of me, like fix it. And when we can't fix it, like the system is broken.
Yes.
Like we are seen as villains. And
Oh,
it's a
yes.
wicked problem. Like there's not a right answer. And like no one is gonna teach you, no one's gonna tell you how to heal yourself. Like nobody knows how to heal yourself.
Oh gosh, this is so, so true. That like you just touched on something that's been in my mind for a long, long time. Like that this sort of like partnership has to exist. Like there has to be responsibility, commitment, dedication, and understanding on both sides of the healing pathway. Like if you have a healer and you have a person who is a caregiver for an animal, they're both equally involved and
Our team.
part of the team. And I think that involves empowering the caregiver. It involves the caregiver taking responsibility on their own. And I'm reading this book. Oh my God, why am I blanking on it? It's something called I think it's called The Path of Integrity. and it had a chapter about when you meet the right teacher who helps you find the teacher within you. It's not an ego game.
Mhm.
It's that teacher is gonna make you know that you're the teacher,
That's
right?
right. Oh, I like that. Figure out that book
Oh, yes. I
power.
strive when I mentor or when I coach or anything like that's my goal. I'm like, "Oh my god, that's it. That's what I'm trying to do," and what I see you try to do as well when I see you give this sort of, like, healing wisdom out to the world. It's just like, "You got it, people. It's in you." I know
Listen,
it's
as a
a cliche, but it's also
oh,
true.
well, I think it's hard because like, there's the thing that is infinite and, like, words can't describe, and then there's, like, the thoughts that we have it in our heads, and then, like, the words that come out of our mouth, so we're really, like, a few degrees removed from, like, the actual thing, and so I think there's so many ways to, like, say something, like, we're all saying the same thing in different words, and so I think, like, once you hear it, like, in a language that you can understand, it's like fireworks, like, "Oh my god,
Yeah.
yes!"
Resonance.
Yeah, 100%.
So, there's just so many things to say and so many things to agree with. We're very, very aligned. It's, like, uncanny, like, I love everything you said from the toxic, femininity to you know, I mean, I'm a feminist, but I think you have to be I identify as that, but you have to be very careful about it not becoming, a toxic femininity and bashing people who it has is not their fault or, toxic positivity and all these toxic things, there's just so many aspects of everything, including healing. And I mean, I think that sort of ties back into the fact that as healers, we can be toxic to ourselves just through our lineage, through our history, and even the healing process from that toxicity can get toxic through blame, as you also alluded to. So it's all so connected. And so there's just like the healing process is so like what are those little like Petrushka dolls? It's like one thing within another, within another, within
Yeah,
another, and so many
not linear.
layers and fractalness to it, how to handle this, and every aspect of it needs to be thought about deeply and from every aspect and who's experienced what and what effect that's had on everyone. And so your thought process just like sparks in my brain. Like, my God, that's it, girl. And so I think you've shared with us a little bit about this sort of links back into like maybe why our industry suffers with the suicide rate that it does and the hurt that we feel as practitioners. And you have shared a little bit about your own healing journey and what's helped you. And I mean, there's just been wisdom sprinkled left and right through this episode. Love it. I think it's just good, 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 good. And thank you for all of that. And so you also recently got involved. I alluded to this before with an organization supporting folks with identify with having bipolar disorder. And you wrote this really cool piece for them. I loved reading it. Can you share a little bit about what that project is all about, that organization, what your article was about? And we'll share your article as well in the show notes for people to check out.
Yeah, so once I got my diagnosis, I started just looking up stuff on the internet and, as one does. And yeah, I started like following different things on the Instagram and found this organization called the International Bipolar Foundation and started reading some of their blogs. And they have this series called Faces of Hope and Recovery. And I started reading some of those and it was like, here's real life people. Like, I think that's part of ending stigma too is like humanizing these experiences and be like, "Oh my gosh, like here's this person and they're talking about it like, ah." And they also had a free book called Healthy Living with Bipolar Disorder and kind of like all those things together, yeah, really kind of started to change my story and kind of recognize like, oh, like here's lies that I tell myself that I didn't know that I was really telling myself. And yeah, they're all about ending stigma and education and yeah, really like challenging and changing those like internalized negative beliefs and giving people a platform to be able to tell their story. And yeah, I think if you find people who are like you, who share your experiences and like it makes you feel less alone. And yeah, just like seeing other people tell their stories in a way that's not demonizing and pathologizing. It's just healing starts to happen there. And like like, it gives you, like, language, it gives you words to start to talk about things that maybe were buried or maybe, like, things you didn't even know you thought of, like, "Oh my gosh," like, I never like, "Oh," like, that's what something I thought too, like, I didn't even know, and it's, like, this idea too of, like, healing happens in safe spaces, and so I think one of the greatest advantages of, like, us all being trapped in our houses for 2 years is, like, there's this incredible amount of support groups that are available for, like, everything, like, everything.
Yeah.
And, like, yeah, you don't have to tell everybody, like, not all soil can bear all fruit, and so, like, there definitely is the potential, like, if you tell of oversharing, like, there's some people who, like, don't want to hear or, like, won't be very kind or, like, accepting if you are vulnerable about that, and so, I think in, like, September of last year, I sent out, like, a little thing for, like, application to, like, be a part of this, like, Faces of Hope and Recovery, and it sat in my inbox until March because I didn't feel comfortable sharing it until then, and then I did, and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna put it in here," and I was like, "Okay," and then they told me it was gonna come out, like, I think it was, like, a week or 2, and then but it just so happened I found out that, like, there's a day for everything now, and, like, March 30th is International Bipolar Day, and, like,
Cool.
I just felt, like, drawn to say, like, as part like, I've always wanted to be, like, a mental health advocate, but it's like, I don't really know how to do that. And it's like, well, educating others and changing your internalized negative beliefs is how you do that. And so, like, to be able to share in a way that doesn't blame anybody and also, like, it helps me, like, accept myself and say, like, "This is who I am, and it's hard." Like, and
Yeah.
hoping, like, other people can see that too and, like, hope that can kinda keep passing that chain along. Like, I saw other people do it and, like, that helped me do it, so maybe if I do it, like, can kind of, like, start to build this, like, network of people who feel comfortable doing it, and yeah, they have all sorts of things, so really kinda starting to be more brave about that and starting to realize that kind of my big art project is, like, how do I help other people learn how to retell their stories? And so been doing more writing and more speaking and have a couple of talks coming up about neurodivergence and a couple of articles that are coming together and
You're starting a podcast too.
starting a
Tell me
podcast.
about that. Tell me about all this cool stuff you're
Ah,
progress
so
of working
yeah,
on.
the other thing we mentioned earlier has been doing facilitating these artist groups, and so we've been going through Julia Cameron's The Artist Way, and I've done that a couple times, and,
Of it.
the next one is coming up starting May 1st, so there's an application open on the link in my bio. And then another idea that came out of the last round I do this is, wanting to start a podcast, so it is gonna come out this fall, and there's also an application on the link in the bio if you would like to be interviewed on this podcast. It is called Dinner with a Side of Death, so this idea came from my husband is a funeral director, and I've heard many people say, like, "You must have very interesting conversations at dinner." I was like, "You know what? I do." And so,
You.
yeah, like, other people might wanna have these conversations too, and so kind of the idea is conscious conversations at the intersection of science and psychology and spirituality, and as you can tell, like, I'm not really a fan of small talk, and I think we do need spaces to have these conversations on these really difficult subjects, so not everybody wants to and definitely can bring up difficult emotions, but you don't have to listen to it if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But we really need to be able to change the stories that we tell ourselves on a personal level and really, like, start to examine and seek understanding of these, like, absolute truths. So there's going to be, like, shorter kind of like 5 to 10 minute episodes where I kind of really, like, dig deeper into, like, some of these ideas and topics that we talk about, like hero's journey and heroine's journey and, like, the drama triangle and all these other things, and then kind of longer episodes where I find, like, super cool people who like to talk about deep things and share ways that they have been able to change their story and how they have learned to change them. So, yeah, planning on having that come out this fall because I always have a million projects. And yeah, if you want to be on it, fill out the little thing, link in the bio.
I
And
have to. I have to commend you. What a good idea to have a link. I think I might, if it's okay with you, do a similar thing to
100%, you can,
apply to be on the show.
yeah.
Mad props and thank you for that idea. But your podcast sounds so cool. I know just knowing you, like it's gonna be thebomb.com and like it can't not be incredible. So
I'm looking forward to it.
stay tuned for Dr. Amanda Doran's podcast and check out the Artist's Way groups that she runs and check out all the links in the show notes because Amanda has been kind enough to share a ton of resources relating to what we talked about today. And I wanted to close by just saying thank you for your bravery and thank you for your honesty as always and your humor and your magic and letting me see the inside of your closet, which is pretty cool. I see something that looks like an apron with strawberries or flowers on it. I like that. Look
This is
at
a
that.
rose dress.
Oh,
I like 50s cocktail dresses.
very nice.
That's one of them.
Love it. Love it. It's even more intimate when you see the inside of someone's closet while you talk to them. So, thanks again for all those things. It's been amazing having you on the podcast as usual. And thanks again.
Thank you.
All right. We'll catch you later.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the House Call Vet Cafe. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit the subscribe or follow button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never have to miss an episode. This podcast is made specifically for you, so don't be shy if you'd like to reach out and let me know your thoughts on this episode. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook as the House Call Vet Academy, where I also share more valuable content. If you're interested in learning more about consulting for House Call Vets or the House Call Vet Academy online course and community, please click on the link in the show notes. Have an amazing rest of your day, and I can't wait for you to join us for our next episode of the House Call Vet Cafe.